You're walking down the street when you see them. The person with the cardboard sign, the outstretched hand, the desperate eyes. Your pocket feels heavy with loose change. Society whispers in your ear that this is your moment to prove your humanity. That compassion is measured by how quickly you reach for your wallet. But what if I told you that every time you help a beggar, you're not just wasting your resources, you're actively participating in a system that destroys both you and them? 500 years ago, a man named Niccolo Machiavelli sat in exile, watching the political theater of Renaissance Italy unfold before him. He observed something that made the moral philosophers of his time uncomfortable. He noticed that the most generous rulers were often the first to fall. The kindest nobles were the ones whose throats got slit in the night, and the people who helped beggars most frequently were the ones who ended up surrounded by enemies. This wasn't coincidence. This was human nature operating according to laws that most people refuse to acknowledge. Machiavelli wrote these observations down, and they became some of the most controversial ideas in human history. Today, I'm going to show you why helping beggars, whether they're on the street corner or in your social circle, is not just ineffective but strategically dangerous, and why understanding this principle might be the difference between you controlling your life and your life controlling you. Let me start with a story that Machiavelli himself witnessed. There was a Florentine merchant named Lorenzo di Marco, successful, wealthy, and by all accounts a good man. Every morning on his way to conduct business, Lorenzo would pass the same beggar outside the cathedral, an old man with a limp who claimed to be a veteran of foreign wars. Lorenzo felt pity. He began giving the man a few coins each day. The beggar was grateful, blessing Lorenzo's name, promising prayers for his prosperity, but something interesting happened over time. The beggar began to expect the coins. When Lorenzo was late, the beggar would grow agitated. When Lorenzo gave less than usual, the beggar would complain that it wasn't enough. When Lorenzo occasionally walked a different route and missed the beggar entirely, the old man would seek him out, demanding to know why he had been ignored. The dynamic had shifted. Lorenzo was no longer a generous benefactor. He had become a resource to be managed and manipulated. The story gets worse. One day, Lorenzo's business suffered a setback. He had less money to spare, so he explained to the beggar that he could only give half the usual amount. The beggar flew into a rage. He accused Lorenzo of being greedy, of forgetting his Christian duty, of becoming corrupted by wealth. Within a week, rumors began spreading through Florence that Lorenzo was a miser who hoarded grain while the poor starved. The very man Lorenzo had helped for months had become his most vocal enemy. This is what Machiavelli called the beggar's paradox. The person you help will inevitably become the person who resents you most. Not because they're inherently evil, but because human psychology operates on principles that have nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with power dynamics. When you help a beggar, you create what psychologists now call a dependency relationship. The beggar learns that their problems can be solved not through their own effort, but through manipulating your emotions. They become skilled at presenting their desperation in exactly the way that triggers your desire to help. This isn't conscious manipulation, at least not at first. It's adaptive behavior. They're learning what works. But here's the crucial part that most people miss. Every time you help, you're not just solving their immediate problem. You're training them to see you as a solution dispenser. And solution dispensers are not respected, they're used. Think about any relationship you've had where you were constantly the one giving help, solving problems, providing resources. Did that person respect you more over time, or did they begin to take you for granted? The modern world is full of beggars who don't look like the traditional image. They're your coworker who's always having a crisis right before a deadline, expecting you to cover for them. They're your friend who constantly needs to borrow money, but never quite gets around to paying it back. They're your family member who always has an emergency that requires your immediate attention and resources. They're the person on social media who's always crowdfunding their latest disaster. These people have learned, consciously or unconsciously, that presenting yourself as helpless is a form of power. When you're the one with the crisis, everyone else has to react to you. You control the conversation. You get attention, resources, and most importantly, you get to avoid taking responsibility for your own life. Machiavelli observed that in politics, the weakest position you can put yourself in is to be seen as someone who responds to begging, because once that reputation is established, the beggars multiply, word spreads. And suddenly you're not dealing with one person's problems, you're dealing with an entire ecosystem of people who see you as a resource to be harvested. Let me give you a modern example. There was a tech entrepreneur, let's call him David, who built a successful software company. David came from a poor background, so when he started making money, he felt obligated to help others who were struggling. He began by helping a few friends with their rent when they were between jobs. Word spread that David was generous with people who were down on their luck. Soon, he was getting messages from acquaintances, then friends of friends, then complete strangers who had heard he was someone who helped people in need. David's mistake was thinking that helping people would create loyalty and goodwill. Instead, it created a network of people who saw him as a walking ATM. When he started setting boundaries, when he began saying no to requests, the people he had helped didn't quietly accept his decision. They became angry. They accused him of changing, of becoming greedy, of forgetting where he came from. Some of them began spreading rumors that his business success was built on exploitation. The very people he had helped became his most vocal critics. This is the pattern that Machiavelli identified centuries ago. The beggar doesn't just want help with their immediate problem. They want to establish a relationship where you are responsible for solving their problems permanently. And when you inevitably fail to meet this impossible standard, they don't blame themselves for being unreasonable. They blame you for being selfish. The psychology behind this is fascinating and brutal. When someone asks you for help, they're admitting that they're in a position of weakness. This admission creates shame, even if they don't consciously acknowledge it. Every human being wants to see themselves as capable and self-sufficient. When they have to beg, it contradicts this self-image. The mind resolves this contradiction not by accepting responsibility, but by reframing the narrative. They begin to tell themselves that they shouldn't have had to ask, that if you were truly generous, you would have offered help before they needed to request it, that if you really cared, you would give more, that your help came with strings attached or ulterior motives. Gradually, in their mind, they transform from someone who needed help into someone who was exploited by your conditional generosity. This psychological transformation is why Machiavelli wrote that men judge more by their eyes than by their hands. People remember how you made them feel, not what you actually did for them. And helping someone who begs makes them feel weak, dependent, and ashamed. They will remember that feeling and associate it with you, even if you were the one who solved their problem. The strategic error that most people make is assuming that generosity creates loyalty. In reality, generosity without boundaries creates contempt. When you give someone something they haven't earned, you're not helping them. You're enabling them. You're teaching them that their problems are your responsibility, and people don't respect those who take responsibility for problems that aren't theirs. Machiavelli understood that respect and gratitude are not the same thing. Gratitude is temporary and conditional. Respect is lasting and strategic. You earn respect by demonstrating that your resources and attention have value and that access to them must be earned. You lose respect by giving these things away to anyone who asks. Let's talk about what this looks like in practice. The beggar on the street corner isn't just asking for money. They're asking you to take responsibility for their situation. When you give them money, you're accepting that responsibility. You're agreeing that their problem is now partially yours to solve. This creates a relationship where they have power over you, because they can always come back and activate your sense of obligation. The same dynamic plays out in professional settings. The coworker who's always behind on their work and needs your help isn't just asking for assistance. They're asking you to take responsibility for their professional success. When you consistently help them meet their deadlines, you're not being a good team player. You're enabling their lack of preparation and making yourself responsible for their performance. In personal relationships, the friend or family member who's always in crisis isn't just unlucky. They've learned that crisis is a tool for controlling other people's behavior. When you respond to their emergencies, you're training them to create more emergencies. You're teaching them that the way to get your attention and resources is to be helpless. This is why Machiavelli advised rulers to be feared rather than loved. Fear is based on consequences that the other person controls. If they behave well, they have nothing to fear. If they behave poorly, they face predictable consequences. This creates a relationship where the other person is responsible for the outcomes they experience. Love, particularly the kind of love that expresses itself through unconditional helping, is based on the other person's needs and emotions. This creates a relationship where you are responsible for their emotional state and their problems. They learn to manage you by managing their presentation of their needs. The most dangerous thing about helping beggars is that it's addictive for both parties. The beggar becomes addicted to having their problems solved by others. They lose the skills and confidence necessary to solve problems themselves. You become addicted to the temporary feeling of being needed and appreciated. You mistake dependency for loyalty and manipulation for genuine connection. Breaking this cycle requires understanding that true help doesn't look like giving someone what they're asking for. True help looks like creating conditions where they can get what they need through their own efforts. This means offering opportunities instead of handouts. It means providing tools instead of solutions. It means setting boundaries instead of being endlessly available. When someone asks you for money, the strategic response is not to give them money. The strategic response is to offer them a way to earn money. When someone asks you to solve their problem, the strategic response is not to solve it for them. The strategic response is to help them develop the skills to solve it themselves. When someone asks you to take responsibility for their crisis, the strategic response is to help them understand how to prevent similar crises in the future. This approach does something that direct helping never accomplishes. It preserves the other person's dignity and self-respect. When someone earns something with your guidance, they don't feel ashamed. They feel proud. They don't resent you for making them feel weak. They respect you for believing they were strong enough to succeed. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the difference between feared leaders and hated leaders. A feared leader is someone whose boundaries are clear and whose consequences are predictable. People respect feared leaders because they know where they stand. A hated leader is someone who is unpredictable, whose help comes with hidden costs, whose generosity creates obligation and resentment. When you help beggars indiscriminately, you're not being compassionate. You're being unpredictable. People don't know what they have to do to earn your respect versus what they can get simply by appearing helpless. This creates anxiety and resentment because they can never be sure of their standing with you. The strategic alternative is to be completely clear about your boundaries and your expectations. People should understand that your time, attention, and resources are valuable and that access to them is earned through specific behaviors and attitudes. This doesn't make you heartless. It makes you predictable and therefore trustworthy. Let me give you a framework for thinking about this strategically. Every request for help falls into one of three categories. First, there are genuine emergencies. These are temporary situations caused by circumstances beyond the person's control. A medical crisis, a natural disaster, an unexpected job loss due to company closure. These situations call for temporary assistance with a clear end point. Second, there are chronic problems. These are ongoing situations that the person has some control over but isn't addressing effectively. Financial problems due to poor spending habits, relationship problems due to poor communication skills, work problems due to lack of preparation or skill development. These situations call for guidance and skill building, not direct assistance. Third, there are manufactured crises. These are situations that the person has created or allowed to develop because they've learned that crisis gets them attention and resources. The person who's always having rent emergencies despite having a steady income. The person who's always having relationship drama despite choosing the same type of problematic partners. The person who's always having work crises despite having had the same job for years. Your strategic response should be different for each category. For genuine emergencies, you can provide temporary assistance with a clear timeline and expectations. For chronic problems, you provide guidance, resources for skill building and accountability, but not direct solutions. For manufactured crises, you provide nothing except perhaps information about professional resources they can access on their own. The key is recognizing which category you're dealing with and not allowing people to present manufactured crises as genuine emergencies. This requires you to look at patterns over time rather than responding to individual incidents in isolation. Machiavelli observed that the most successful rulers were those who could distinguish between people who were genuinely struggling due to circumstances and people who were using struggle as a strategy for controlling others. The rulers who failed were those who responded to all requests for help as if they were equivalent. This brings us to one of the most important strategic principles in human relationships. Your willingness to help should be inversely related to how much someone begs. The more desperate someone appears, the more skeptical you should be of their request. This sounds counterintuitive because we've been conditioned to respond to displays of desperation with immediate assistance. But desperation is often performed rather than genuine. People who are genuinely struggling tend to be embarrassed about asking for help. They minimize their requests, they offer to pay you back or return the favor somehow, they provide detailed explanations of their circumstances and their plans for preventing similar problems in the future. People who are using desperation as a strategy tend to maximize their displays of need. They provide vague explanations of their circumstances, they make no mention of how they plan to prevent similar problems, and they often become angry or manipulative if you ask questions or suggest alternatives to direct assistance. Learning to recognize the difference between genuine need and performed desperation is a crucial skill for anyone who wants to avoid being manipulated. It requires you to pay attention to patterns rather than individual incidents, to ask questions rather than simply responding emotionally, and to observe whether people's actions match their stated circumstances. The most sophisticated beggars don't ask for money or direct assistance. They ask for emotional labor. They want you to listen to their problems, to validate their feelings, to provide sympathy and support. This seems harmless, but it's actually more dangerous than direct financial requests because it's harder to recognize and harder to set boundaries around. When someone consistently uses you as an emotional dumping ground, they're training you to see your role in their life as being responsible for their emotional regulation. They're not coming to you for advice or genuine support. They're coming to you to avoid dealing with their problems themselves. Your attention and sympathy become a drug that helps them avoid the discomfort of taking responsibility for their situation. This creates the same dependency dynamic as financial begging, but it's disguised as friendship or caring. The person becomes addicted to your emotional availability, and you become trapped in a relationship where you're constantly managing their feelings instead of focusing on your own goals and well-being. The strategic response to emotional begging is the same as the response to financial begging. You offer tools and guidance rather than direct emotional labor. You help them identify resources for professional support. You set boundaries around how much time and energy you're willing to invest in their problems. And you make it clear that your role is not to make them feel better about situations they have the power to change. Machiavelli understood that the most dangerous enemies are often the people you've helped most. This is because helping someone creates an intimate knowledge of their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. When they inevitably turn against you, they know exactly how to hurt you most effectively. They know your generous impulses, your emotional triggers, and your sense of obligation. This is why strategic thinking requires you to consider not just the immediate effects of your actions, but the long-term relationship dynamics you're creating. When you help someone who begs, you're not just solving their current problem. You're establishing yourself as someone who can be manipulated through displays of need. You're creating a relationship where they have power over you because they can always activate your desire to help. The alternative is to establish yourself as someone who helps people become more capable rather than someone who makes people more comfortable in their incapacity. This means your assistance always comes with expectations for growth and change. It means you measure success not by how grateful people are, but by how much less they need your help over time. This approach requires you to be comfortable with being seen as demanding or unsympathetic by people who want to use you as a resource. It requires you to prioritize long-term strategic relationships over short-term emotional satisfaction. It requires you to understand that true compassion sometimes looks like refusing to enable someone's self-destructive patterns. The beggar on the street corner, the crisis-prone friend, the manipulative coworker, they all represent the same strategic challenge. They're testing whether you understand the difference between helping and enabling, between compassion and manipulation, between genuine need and performed desperation. Your response determines not just whether you waste your resources, but whether you maintain your strategic position in your relationships and your life. Machiavelli's insight was that human nature operates according to predictable patterns that have nothing to do with moral ideals and everything to do with power dynamics. Understanding these patterns doesn't make you cynical or heartless. It makes you effective. It allows you to help people in ways that actually strengthen them rather than creating dependency. It protects you from being manipulated by people who have learned to weaponize others' generosity. The next time someone approaches you with desperate need, remember Lorenzo and his beggar. Remember that every act of help creates a relationship dynamic that will persist long after the immediate problem is solved. Ask yourself whether you're being asked to solve a problem or to take responsibility for someone else's life. Ask yourself whether your help will make this person stronger or more dependent. Ask yourself whether you're responding to genuine need or performed desperation. Your answers will determine whether you're building strategic relationships based on mutual respect or enabling relationships based on manipulation and dependency. They'll determine whether you're someone who is valued for your wisdom and boundaries or someone who is used for your resources and emotional labor. They'll determine whether you control your own life or spend it being controlled by other people's crises. This is the brutal truth that Machiavelli understood and that most people refuse to accept. Helping beggars is not compassionate. It's strategically dangerous. It creates enemies where you intended to create allies. It rewards manipulation where you intended to reward honesty. It enables weakness where you intended to support strength. The world is not governed by moral ideals, but by strategic realities. Understanding this doesn't make you evil, it makes you effective. And in a world full of people who will use your generosity against you, effectiveness is not just an advantage, it's survival.